There is a particular kind of stillness that happens just before sleep, when the room has gone dark and the sounds of the day have softened to almost nothing. Your breath slows without any effort on your part. The weight of your body settles into whatever surface holds you, and the boundary between yourself and the quiet air around you grows thin and uncertain, the way the line between water and sky dissolves at dusk on a perfectly calm evening. Your hands, which have been busy all day doing useful and necessary things, finally go still. Your shoulders, which have been holding themselves up against some invisible pressure since morning, let go slowly, by degrees, the way ice releases its grip on a stone in early spring. It is in those moments, the ones that exist just at the edge of wakefulness, just before the deeper country of sleep claims you entirely, that the oldest and deepest stories begin to feel most true. Not true in the way that facts are true, but true in the way that certain dreams are true, carrying in them some quality of recognition, some faint and inexplicable memory of a world you cannot quite name and have never in this life visited. Somewhere out beyond the old world's western edge, past the narrow throat of sea that ancient sailors called the Pillars of Heracles, the place we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar, where the enclosed blue Mediterranean opens its mouth into the vast gray Atlantic, there was once said to be an island. Larger than Asia and Libya combined, Plato wrote, with fertile plains and hot springs and cold springs rising from the same generous earth, with mountains green with timber and meadows full of every variety of animal, with harbors full of ships, with temples whose metals caught the light of every rising and every setting sun. The island was called Atlantis. It has not been found in 2,300 years of searching, and yet the story of it has never stopped moving through human minds, passed from one generation to the next like something carried carefully in cupped hands, warm and faintly glowing, the bearer not quite sure what it is, but certain only that it must not be dropped. Let it come to you now, unhurried, the way all the best things come to us in the night hours. Let the story breathe in the quiet of this room. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do or solve or remember. Only this, the oldest of lost things, drifting toward you gently through the dark, asking nothing of you except to be still and to receive it. The story as we know it begins in Athens, in the year 360 before the Common Era, in the mind of a philosopher who was then nearly 70 years old. Plato had spent his life thinking about the nature of justice, the structure of ideal states, the relationship between the human soul and the larger order of the cosmos. He had written the Republic, that great and meticulous dream of a city governed by wisdom rather than appetite. And now, he was turning his attention to something more architecturally concrete, or at least something that wore the costume of the concrete. He began writing two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, set during the festival of Athens's patron goddess Athena, in which a small group of thoughtful men gathered to share ideas over the course of a long and companionable afternoon. It is worth imagining that afternoon for a moment before we follow the story further. Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era had a particular quality of light, the same white Mediterranean light that still falls on those limestone hillsides today, dry and clear and slightly sharp at its edges, the kind of light that makes the shapes of things very precise. The men gathering for this conversation would have been draped in wool or linen, moving through rooms where oil lamps guttered softly in whatever faint breeze came through unshuttered windows. They would have eaten earlier and drunk wine mixed with water in the Greek fashion, and the atmosphere of such philosophical conversations was generally one of relaxed attentiveness, of minds pleasantly alert and willing to follow an argument wherever it led, however long the road turned out to be. In the Timaeus, the character Critias, named for a real Athenian politician, though scholars have long debated which exact generation of the family Plato intended, offers to tell a story that will give life and movement to the ideal society Socrates has been sketching. He has a tale, he says, that is not invented but historical. His grandfather heard it from the statesman Solon, who brought it back from Egypt. And in that story, the Athens of 9,000 years ago, 9,000 years before Solon's own time, had stood against a mighty empire from beyond the Western Ocean and prevailed. The empire was Atlantis. There is a quality to this chain of transmission that is worth turning over slowly in your mind as you begin to settle toward sleep, because it tells us something important about how stories move through the world, and why the ones that matter most always seem to arrive from somewhere just beyond the edge of confirmed memory. Plato does not say he invented Atlantis. He says the story came to him through a chain of human memory, person to person, generation to generation, each one carrying it forward with the weight and warmth of something deeply felt, if not always perfectly preserved. The great classical scholar A. Lee Taylor, one of the 20th century's most careful readers of Plato, observed that the text could scarcely make it plainer that the entire narrative of Solon's Egyptian encounter was Plato's own literary construction, a philosophical device chosen with deliberate care and used with extraordinary art. Christopher Gill of the University of Exeter, in his foundational 1977 study published in Classical Philology, argued that the Atlantis story belongs to a genre that Plato was in the process of inventing. Extended fictional narrative dressed in the clothing of eyewitness history, its insistence on truth not a literal assertion, but part of the fiction's own mechanism, lending the philosophical argument the urgency and texture of something actually witnessed and remembered by real people across real generations. And yet this does not make the story less beautiful. Quite the reverse. Because Plato was not a man who invented things carelessly or without deep purpose. Every element he placed in the Atlantis narrative was chosen to carry meaning, to serve his larger argument about how cities rise and how they fall, about what happens to a people when the divine inheritance they have received begins to thin, when the gold of their original character is gradually alloyed with something baser and less patient. What he built was not a forgery but a meditation, perhaps the most detailed and architecturally beautiful meditation on the fragility of greatness that the ancient world ever produced. It is a story told by a very old man who had spent a lifetime watching cities and people and ideals rise and decline, and who wanted, one last time, to show what he had seen in a form that would last. The Critias, which follows the Timaeus and goes deeper into the description of Atlantis and its people, breaks off mid-sentence, as though Plato was drawn away before he could complete it, or found himself standing at a threshold his art could not quite cross. The ending has been lost to time, leaving the story perpetually open, perpetually hovering just at the edge of its own completion, which may be part of why it has never quite let go of the human imagination in the 2,500 years since it was first told. An ending would have closed it. The absence of an ending keeps it alive, breathing, still arriving. To understand where the Atlantis story was born, or at least where Plato placed its birth, you have to travel in your mind to Egypt, to the Nile Delta, to a city called Sais that sat among the branching water channels where the great river fans out toward the sea. The city of Sais was the home of the goddess Neith, whom the Greeks identified with their own Athena, goddess of wisdom, of craft, of the ordered intelligence that holds civilization together through its long, ordinary days. When Herodotus traveled through Egypt a generation before Plato, he noted the connection between Sais and Athens as something the Egyptians themselves liked to claim, that these two peoples, separated by so much water and so many centuries, were in some ancient sense kindred. Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens, traveled to Egypt between roughly 590 and 580 before the Common Era, in the years following his famous reforms at home. He had reshaped Athenian society with a careful hand, canceling debts that had pushed many citizens into servitude, reorganizing the classes of citizenship according to wealth and contribution, rather than birth alone, writing laws and carving them into rotating wooden tablets so that anyone who wished could read them. He was one of the 7 sages of the ancient Greek world, a poet as well as a statesman, and the Egyptians, who prized learning above almost everything else, would have received him with genuine warmth. Plutarch, writing centuries after the fact, tells us that Solon spent time in study with a priest named Sais of Sais, described as the most learned of all the priests. Proclus, the 5th century philosopher, gives us still other names in his commentary on the Timaeus, Patenate at Sais, Ochalapi at Heliopolis, Ethamen at Sebennytus, as though the wisdom Solon gathered was distributed among many rooms, many temple libraries, many long and quiet conversations held in the particular still air of the Egyptian interior. In Plato's telling, the encounter between Solon and the priests has a quality of gentle humbling that is very beautiful to sit with. Solon, a man of formidable learning acknowledged across the known world, begins to speak of ancient Greek history. He tells the priests about Pharaonius, said to be the first man, and Niobe, and the great flood of Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, and all the mythological deep past of his culture. He is being a good guest, sharing what he knows, making conversation across the considerable distance between an Athenian statesman and an Egyptian temple priest. And the old priest stops him, not unkindly, with something like patience and something like affection, and says, "You Greeks are always children. You have no old beliefs, no knowledge hoary with age. Your genealogies are young. Your floods and fires are only scattered fragments, individual disasters lifted out of context from much longer cycles of destruction and renewal that Egypt has witnessed many times and recorded with great care. In our temples," the priest says, "we have registers going back thousands and thousands of years, and in those registers there is preserved a history of Athens that the Athenians themselves have entirely forgotten." There is something very tender in this moment, if you sit with it in the dark. The idea that the deepest parts of your own past might be held somewhere else, preserved in someone else's memory, tended in someone else's archive. that the things you have forgotten about yourself might still exist, waiting patiently, written in a script you cannot read, in a room you have never entered, looked after by people who feel themselves to be, for reasons no one can quite account for, your very distant relatives. The priest at Sais tells Solon that the goddess Neith is the same as Athena, and that the people of Sais are in some ancient sense akin to the Athenians, and that in their registers they have preserved the memory of a great war, 9,000 years past, in which a noble Athens stood against the empire of Atlantis and prevailed, and then was itself swept away in the earthquake and flood that took the island. It is through this quiet conversation, in a columned room in the delta, surrounded by the smell of river water and oil lamps and the ancient linen wrappings of a civilization far older than Greece, that the story of Atlantis enters the written record of the world. It passed from the priests to Solon, from Solon to his relative Dropides, from Dropides through the generations of his family, each one telling the next until it reached the Critias who speaks in Plato's dialogues. 4 generations of memory, each one carrying the story carefully forward, like a lamp passed hand to hand through a long and gentle dark. The Atlantis tale is doubly mediated, doubly removed from any original source. It reaches us through Plato's voice, speaking through Critias, who claims to remember it from Solon, who heard it in the temple of Neith from a priest whose name we do not know for certain. Each layer of transmission could be a diminishment. But in another way, each layer adds something, the warmth of human care, the sense that the story mattered enough to be worth carrying forward across generations, even imperfectly, even partially, even in the form of a very long and very loving embellishment of something that was perhaps originally much simpler. What did Atlantis look like? Plato describes it with a specificity that has fascinated readers for centuries, precise enough to feel architectural, vivid enough to linger in the mind like a half-remembered dream of somewhere you have been and cannot quite place. The island itself lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, in the open ocean the Greeks called the Sea of Atlas. It was vast, larger than Libya and Asia combined, Plato says, which in his terms meant something like the entirety of the known world compressed into a single island, a landmass almost unimaginable in scale. The land was fertile in a way that sounds paradisiacal in its generosity. It produced 2 harvests each year. It was rich with great forests on its mountains. Its meadows supported every kind of animal, including, as Plato specifies with wonderful particularity, great numbers of elephants, those largest and most voracious of creatures, for whom the island provided ample marshes and rivers and meadows, and all the food such animals require. There was gold in the earth, and silver, and every variety of food grew abundantly from the soil, as if the earth itself were an act of divine generosity toward anyone fortunate enough to live above it. At the island's heart was a low hill rising from a coastal plain, set approximately 50 stadia from the sea, not far and not close, a comfortable middle distance, as if whoever placed it there had thought carefully about the relationship between the center and its surroundings. Here the story of the city begins, with a god's love expressed in the language of geography. Poseidon, lord of the ocean, came to this island and found there a mortal woman named Cleito, daughter of Evenor and Leucippe, 2 of the island's earliest inhabitants. He loved her, as gods in ancient stories often love mortals completely, with a devotion that expressed itself not in poetry but in practical architecture. To protect her, or perhaps simply to make her dwelling magnificent, he carved the hill where Plato lived into a palace set within concentric rings, alternating bands of sea and land, 2 rings of land and 3 of water, each separated from the next and encircling the central hill like the calm ripples that spread outward from a stone dropped into perfectly still water. He called up 2 springs from beneath the earth, one of warm water and one of cold, and made every variety of food grow abundantly in the soil around the central island. In that place, he made his home with Plato and had 5 pairs of twin sons with her, who became the first kings of Atlantis and the ancestors of all its people. The eldest of these sons was named Atlas, and from him, the island and the ocean surrounding it took their names that still move through our language: Atlantis, Atlantic, names that echo still in our geography even when we have forgotten their origin. The other 9 brothers received portions of the vast island to govern, each developing his territory, and from all 10 descended the families that would rule Atlantis for generation after generation, always with the eldest son of the eldest line, holding the title of High King above the rest. The city that grew up around that original hill was described by Plato in terms that would have struck his ancient readers as simultaneously wondrous and recognizable. The kind of city you can almost imagine, almost picture, that stays just at the edge of perfect clarity. The Atlanteans built bridges across the water rings, connecting the bands of habitable land with routes wide enough for large vehicles and crowds, and they dug a great canal from the outer sea to the outermost ring, 100 feet wide, 30 feet deep, and 50 stadia long, through which the ships of the harbor could pass into the heart of the city like water finding its natural level. Each ring of land was encircled by a wall, and those walls were covered with metals. The outermost ring's wall was coated in bronze, the next in tin, and the innermost wall, the wall of the citadel at the hill's own summit, was clad entirely in orichalcum, a metal described as second in value only to gold itself, and said to glow with a warm red light, so that the innermost heart of the city blazed like a banked coal at its center, visible from far out to sea as ships approached through the long canal. The walls themselves were built from stone quarried directly from the moats that surrounded the rings, stone that came naturally in 3 colors, white and black and red, so that the city's structures had a quality of visual richness drawn directly from the island's own body, rather than borrowed from distant quarries. The central island held a palace of extraordinary size, expanded by successive kings over the centuries, each generation adding to what had come before, so that by the time Critias describes it, the palace had grown into something almost too magnificent to summarize. At the top of the central hill, visible from the palace and from much of the surrounding city, stood the temple of Poseidon. The temple's exterior was plated in silver, with pinnacles of gold that caught the morning and evening light and held it visibly against the sky. Its interior was vaulted in ivory and richly worked with gold and silver and orichalcum, so that the whole inner space had a warm, gilded quality of light that would have felt different from the sharp white Mediterranean light of the exterior, deeper, softer, more enclosed, more like being inside something alive. The floor and columns were of the same mixed precious materials, and within the temple stood a great statue of Poseidon himself in his chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 nereids riding on dolphins, the whole ensemble suggesting both the power and the grace of the ocean, both its violence and its elegance, and the creatures that move through it in perfect ease. Outside the temple were the hot and cold springs that Poseidon had originally called from the earth, distributed now through a system of stone channels and cisterns to the surrounding city, available to the public in shared bathing areas and in private facilities within the palace, and in separate spaces reserved for women and in great stone troughs for the horses. There was a race course for those horses, running in a great circuit around one of the outer rings, where the sound of hooves in the morning light would have carried across the water to the inner districts, arriving soft and rhythmic like something felt as much as heard. There were gardens and gymnasia and markets. The harbor district was alive at all hours, day and night, with merchants speaking many different languages, their voices mingling in the warm air above the docked ships in a continuous low music of commerce and transaction, and the ordinary industry of a prosperous trading city. Triremes rested at their moorings with the particular stillness of ships at rest, their oars shipped and their sails furled, looking in the harbor light both powerful and patient. Beyond the harbor, the great plain stretched outward, vast and flat and organized, crisscrossed by a system of irrigation channels, lined with villages that contributed to the empire's functioning like the well-tended parts of a living body, each one knowing its obligations and meeting them with the regularity of a society that had long ago decided to organize itself not for the convenience of the few, but for the maintenance of the whole. It is the people themselves, though, the quality of the attention they brought to their own lives and to each other, that occupies the most interesting part of Plato's description, and it is here that the story becomes something more than an ancient wonder and becomes instead a kind of quiet teaching. The Atlanteans, Plato says, were originally of divine descent, children of Poseidon and Plato, carrying in their blood something of the gods' vast and ancient patience. And for many generations, the divine nature lasted in them, and during those generations they were remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with their architecture or their metals or the reach of their empire. They were gentle, Plato writes. They were wise. They looked at the abundance around them with a kind of calm perspective, understanding wealth as something useful rather than as the measure of their worth or the definition of their dignity. They did not let gold make them arrogant. They did not mistake the fact of their power for evidence of their virtue. They bore their prosperity, Plato says, with a certain lightness, the way you carry something well when you understand both its value and its weight, when you are not straining to demonstrate your strength in the carrying. They lived in accordance with the laws inscribed on the great pillar of orichalcum in the temple of Poseidon, gathering every 5th or 6th year, alternating between odd and even years, so that both might receive equal honor, in a great assembly to review those laws together, to deliberate on their justice, to consider any matters of war or peace or governance that concerned the whole empire. The 10 kings came as equals, bound by a shared covenant, reminded by the very ritual of their meeting that no single one of them held ultimate authority, that the power each exercised was not absolute but conditional, not owned but temporarily entrusted by the whole. The ritual of those meetings has a quality that is ceremonial and deeply human at the same time, in the way that the oldest rituals always do when you sit with them patiently. The 10 kings came to the temple of Poseidon, and together they hunted the sacred bulls that ranged freely through the temple grounds, not with weapons of iron, Plato specifies with care, but only with clubs and nooses, a hunt that required patience and coordination, and a certain willingness to be close to something wild and large, without relying on the tools that would make the outcome certain. When they had caught their bull, they led it to the great orichalcum pillar on which the laws were inscribed, and there they sacrificed it, allowing its blood to flow down over the writing, mingling the words of the law with something living and warm. Then they extinguished the fire and draped themselves in their most beautiful dark blue robes, and gathered in the darkness of the temple to make their oaths by the light of the cooling altar. They swore to judge according to the inscribed laws, to hold no grievance over any judgment made in common, to impose no king's authority without the assent of the majority of the 10. They drank from a golden bowl shaped like a bull, each in turn, and offered the remainder to the god's own temple, and then they feasted and conducted their business and rested, and in the morning went their separate ways again, back to the territories they governed, carrying the memory of the oath like something solid tucked close to the body, something that would be felt throughout the year whenever the temptation arose to act as if they were alone and accountable to no one. There is something in this image, the kings gathering not to display their power, but to remind themselves of its limits, the ritual mingling of law and blood in the lamplight, the golden bowl passing from hand to hand in the dark, that feels very quiet and very true to the experience of being human. The Atlanteans of those early centuries were not so much powerful as careful. Careful with their wealth, careful with their authority, careful with each other in the way of people who understand that what they share is more important and more fragile than what they separately possess. Daily life in Atlantis, as you follow Plato's descriptions through their careful details, had the warmth and completeness of a place that had never been required to want for anything, and had also, in its best years, never taken that fact for granted. The markets at the harbor would have smelled of salt and pitch and fresh rope, and the brine of fish brought in from the outer sea. Children would have grown up watching the ships arrive from the islands that Plato mentions in passing as lying between Atlantis and the outer continents, or from ports along the Mediterranean world that the Atlanteans traded with and sometimes governed. The warm springs rising from Poseidon's original gift were still flowing, as they had always flowed, distributed now through stone channels to the public baths, and to the gardens of the temple district, and to the houses of private citizens who had built themselves comfortable homes in the rings of land between the water channels. There would have been the particular sound those channels made as they moved through the city, a constant low conversation of water over stone, audible from the streets of the market district as a faint and pleasant undertone beneath the human sounds of trade and argument, and the cries of children and the particular creak and thud of ships in harbor. The mountains behind the city were full of timber and game. The plain beyond the rings of water was cultivated with the thoroughness of a society that was confident enough in its present to invest seriously in its future. The irrigation channels were lined with stone and maintained by the villages along their courses. The soil was worked in careful rotation so that no part of it was ever exhausted. The harvest came twice each year and was distributed according to obligations that everyone understood and accepted as fair. The elephants grazed in their marshland near the coast, enormous and unhurried, producing a distant sound of movement through high grass that must have been audible on quiet mornings as a kind of deep and rhythmic presence. The horses trained on their circuit track in the cool hours before the day grew warm. The smoke of cooking fires rose from 10,000 hearthstones as the city woke. To wake up in that city, in its best years, would have been to wake into a world arranged thoughtfully around human needs. Not perfectly, because nothing in any real world is ever perfect, but with care and with the intention of care, which is perhaps what Plato most wanted to describe. The laws were fair. The kings were careful. The soil was generous. The springs ran warm and cold from the same earth. The golden bowl was passed in the dark, and each person who drank from it carried the weight of what they had promised. It did not last. Nothing in Plato's moral universe ever does when greatness is involved. He was too honest a thinker for that, and had lived too long and watched too much to pretend that what is good simply continues to be good without effort and vigilance, and the daily renewal of whatever original intention made it good in the first place. The Critias breaks off before it can describe the final war with Athens in full detail, but earlier passages in both dialogues make the arc quietly clear. The divine nature in the Atlanteans gradually thinned, diluted by mortal blood across the generations, until the human portion of their nature began to assert itself more strongly than the divine had done. And what the human portion wanted, when unguided by divine inheritance and unsupported by the original internal discipline that the gods had passed along with the blood, was more. More gold, more territory, more deference, more recognition. The ambitions of the Atlantean kings, which had once expressed themselves in the organization of a just and shared empire, began to express themselves in the expansion of that empire at the expense of others. They became, Plato writes, visibly degraded. And then he adds the observation that gives the whole account its most lasting weight. Though to eyes unable to perceive the true life, they still appeared glorious and blessed at the very time when they were filled with unrighteous avarice and power. This is one of the subtler observations in all of ancient philosophy, and it is worth holding as you rest. That moral decline can be invisible from the outside for a very long time. That a civilization can look at the height of its material splendor precisely at the moment its essential character is becoming hollow. The orichalcum still caught the light. The walls still gleamed with their three metals in the morning. The harbor still hummed with the commerce of a prosperous empire. But something had changed in the quality of attention that the people brought to their own laws, their own ancient covenant, their own shared commitment to the moderation that had made all of it possible in the first place. The gods saw it. Zeus, perceiving that an honorable race was in the most wretched condition, assembled all the gods in the most holy abode and began to speak. And there the Critias stops, mid-sentence, the verdict never rendered in full. We know from the Timaeus what followed: violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea, leaving behind it only shoaling mud where navigators had once sailed freely, a residue of the island's substance disturbing the water as the ocean slowly closed over what had been. A single day and night. That is the phrase that has settled into the human imagination and never quite left it. Not a gradual decline, not centuries of erosion, not the slow forgetting that claims most civilizations in the end. One day and one night, and then the sea and the mud and the long patience of the deep water over everything. There is a particular mercy in this, if you are inclined to look for it. The cataclysm is described not as punishment in any petty sense, but as something more like natural consequence, the way a fire goes out when the fuel that sustained it is finally exhausted. The divine nature was spent. The city that had been built in its image could not hold its form without that original animating quality. The sea came in, and the island returned to Poseidon, who had made it in the first place, and the water closed over it without ceremony, without drama, smooth and indifferent and absolute in the way that only natural processes are ever truly absolute. The Atlantis story did not go down with the island. It surfaced again and again across the centuries, each time in slightly different form, each time adapted to the particular needs and longings of the people carrying it. Among Plato's own contemporaries, Aristotle appears to have regarded the whole thing as deliberate fiction, a literary device Plato had used and then conveniently disposed of. The ancient geographer Strabo repeated the story in a tone of mild scholarly uncertainty. Proclus, the 5th century philosopher, wrote about it at length in his commentary on the Timaeus, citing the Egyptian records and the priests of Sais as sources worth taking seriously, adding details about other priests Solon had visited in other cities, gathering the wisdom of a world that had recorded its history more carefully than Greece had. The story moved through the medieval world in various filtered forms, appearing in the margins of other texts, surfacing in the speculations of geographers and natural philosophers, associated variously with the Americas, with Africa, with any and every territory that lay conveniently beyond the edge of confirmed knowledge. Francis Bacon, in the early 17th century, wrote his utopian novel New Atlantis, setting a wise and moderate civilization on an island in the Pacific, drawing explicitly on Plato's image of an ordered society to imagine what the future might look like if reason and wisdom were given proper authority. It was a different kind of Atlantis, forward-looking rather than backward-looking, hopeful rather than elegiac, but it drew from the same source and addressed the same need, the need to believe that somewhere, once or someday, things had been or would be arranged with care. In the modern era, two particular theories have gathered more sustained attention than all the others. The first connects Atlantis with the Minoan civilization of the Bronze Age Aegean, specifically with the island of Thera, now called Santorini, and the catastrophic volcanic eruption that reshaped it around 1600 before the Common Era. With a volcanic explosivity index of 7, the Minoan eruption was among the most powerful volcanic events in recorded human history, ejecting somewhere between 28 and 41 cubic kilometers of dense rock into the sky and sea, burying the Minoan settlement at Akrotiri under pumice and ash up to 60 meters thick, sending enormous tsunamis racing across the eastern Mediterranean, and dramatically altering the landscape and the human geography of the entire region. When archaeologists began excavating Akrotiri in the 20th century, they found a city preserved beneath the stone in a way that stopped the breath. Walls still standing, streets still recognizable, painted frescoes still bright beneath centuries of ash, showing ships in harbor, showing women in elaborate dress, showing the blue monkeys and the blue birds, and the blue sea that the Minoans painted on their walls with a joy that is still legible across 3,500 years. The city was called the Pompeii of the Aegean, and the comparison was apt in more ways than the obvious. It was preserved not by being destroyed, but by being sealed, locked inside the catastrophe that ended it, kept whole by the very thing that took it away. The Minoan civilization was one of the earliest and most sophisticated in all of Europe, a culture that built great palace complexes on Crete at Knossos and Phaistos and Malea, that traded across the entire Mediterranean world, that produced art of extraordinary refinement and apparent delight, that organized itself around palace economies of considerable complexity. Its relationship to the sea was intimate and essential, its ships ranging widely, and its influence felt from Egypt to the Levant to the Greek mainland. When the eruption of Thera disrupted the trade networks and agricultural patterns of the region, and when the Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland subsequently expanded their power across the eastern Mediterranean, the Minoan world was never quite the same again. The connection to Atlantis is suggestive and appealing. A sophisticated maritime civilization, an island catastrophe, a world transformed in ways that must have felt, to those who lived through them, like the end of something irreplaceable. Scholars who favor this connection often note that Plato's 9,000 years might be a mistranslation or misreading, perhaps originally 900 years, which would place the events squarely in the Bronze Age, within the long memory of Egyptian records. The concentric geography of the Atlantis capital might reflect a distorted memory of Thera's volcanic caldera, which gives the modern island of Santorini its distinctive crescent shape. But the difficulties are real, and they do not resolve easily. Thera is a small island, 28 square kilometers, not the continent-scale landmass Plato described. It lies within the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the outer ocean. The chronology, even adjusted, requires significant creative interpretation to fit Plato's numbers. These complications have not silenced the theory, but they have kept it permanently in the realm of the beautiful and the suggestive rather than the demonstrated. The second great modern chapter in the story of Atlantis belongs to an American congressman from Minnesota named Ignatius Donnelly, who in 1882 published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and changed forever the way the Western world thought about the legend. Donnelly was a remarkable and restless character, a lawyer and politician who had dreamed of building utopian communities, who had won and lost and won, and lost again in the turbulent political world of post-Civil War America, and who brought to his Atlantis research the passionate intensity of a man who had been looking for a long time for something beautiful to believe in. He approached Plato's account as straightforward historical record and argued that all the great ancient civilizations, Egypt and the Americas, Greece and Scandinavia, the cultures of both hemispheres, were the descendants of a single vast lost civilization that had occupied a now-sunken landmass in the Atlantic Ocean, that all of humanity's ancient wisdom had a single and now invisible source. His book was an immediate global sensation. Harper and Brothers issued 7 printings in its first year alone. The British Prime Minister William Gladstone, then in the midst of the profound pressures of governing an empire at a moment of considerable political stress, found time to write Donnelly a 4-page admiring letter. The book shaped every subsequent popular engagement with the Atlantis legend, the idea of a technologically advanced civilization existing before the known historical record, the notion that the similarities between ancient cultures on opposite sides of the ocean had a common source, the image of a golden age destroyed not through gradual decline, but through sudden and total catastrophe. Helena Blavatsky incorporated Donnelly's Atlantis into her theosophical writings, elaborating it into a mystical prehistory of humanity. Rudolf Steiner followed. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic of the early 20th century, delivered in his sleeping trances detailed accounts of Atlantean civilization, locating its remnants near the Bahamas, describing its technology and its spiritual practices with the confident specificity of a man reporting from direct experience. Modern searchers have combed the mid-Atlantic ridge, the Caribbean seafloor, the Canary Islands, the Azores, the coasts of Spain and Morocco, the submerged platforms off the Bahamas, the Saharan geological formation known as the Richat structure in Mauritania, a vast circular feature in the desert that, when viewed from above, bears a striking resemblance to the concentric rings Plato described, and that has attracted considerable excited attention from those who believe the coincidence is more than coincidence. Since Donnelly's day, dozens of locations have been proposed for Atlantis, to the point where the name has become almost a generic concept, a word for any lost world that someone urgently needs to have existed. None of these searches has produced anything that conventional archaeology could accept as evidence of the civilization Plato described. The scholarly consensus, built through generations of careful reading and careful not finding, holds that Atlantis was Plato's own philosophical construction, a thought experiment dressed with extraordinary care in the garments of history, a parable about the nature of hubris and the price of moral decline, and the particular vulnerability of civilizations that mistake their material achievements for spiritual ones. But the story's persistence across 2.5 millennia, its capacity to attract the serious and the obsessive and the creative and the hopeful in equal measure, century after century, culture after culture, is itself a kind of evidence. Not of Atlantis as a place you could visit if only you knew the coordinates, but of something in the structure of human longing that the Atlantis story answers with unusual precision. Something that wants to believe in a world that was once arranged more beautifully than this one. Something that finds in the image of a great civilization swallowed cleanly by the sea a meaning that pure reason cannot provide, a sense that greatness is real, that it once existed somewhere, that its loss was clean and complete rather than the slow and messy erosion that most things actually undergo. What is it that we are really searching for when we search for Atlantis? Here, in the quiet of this room, in the hours when the world has pulled back to its gentlest edges, and the day's demands have released their grip on your body and your mind, it is perhaps easier to feel the answer than to state it precisely. We are looking for proof that something can be both beautiful and real. We are looking for evidence that the worlds we imagine, the cities of just laws and warm springs and careful kings, the societies in which the 10 brothers pass the golden bowl around the fire and remind each other of their limits, are not merely invented but somehow remembered. Not merely wished for, but once actually lived somewhere by people who were not so different from us. We go searching the ocean floor for permission to believe that things do not have to be arranged exactly as they are now. That once, somewhere, for at least a little while, They were arranged more wisely and more gently. Plato understood this need very well. He had spent his entire philosophical life in its service. Whether the story he told was historical record or deliberate philosophical fiction, and the weight of careful scholarship suggests the latter, he built it with extraordinary patience and craft, fitting every element to every other with the care of someone who knows the work will outlast him by a very long time. The warm springs rising from beneath the earth, one warm and one cold from the same generous source. The orichalcum glowing at the citadel's heart in the red afternoon light. The golden bowl passed from hand to hand among the 10 kings in the darkness of the temple. The laws inscribed on a pillar that the blood of a sacrifice touched each time the covenant was renewed. The plain beyond the city, fertile and organized and alive with the small, persistent sounds of ordinary days lived with care and without fear. All of it imagined, all of it given to us across 23 centuries with open hands. The island vanished in a single day and night. But the story of it has been rising and falling and rising again ever since, and it is rising now here, in whatever portion of your resting mind is still awake enough to receive it. Somewhere in the deep Atlantic, or in the volcanic memory of a Bronze Age island in the Aegean, or in a columned room in an Egyptian temple, where an old priest spoke quietly to a Greek traveler about things forgotten and preserved and waiting, or perhaps only in the careful and loving sentences of a philosopher who wanted to show us something true about what we lose when we stop being careful with each other. Somewhere in all of that, Atlantis still moves. Not as a place you could find on any map, but as a quality of attention, a way of holding the world as something entrusted rather than owned. A reminder that the golden bowl must be passed around, that each person who drinks from it carries the weight of what they have promised, that no one of us is more than a single strand in something larger and more durable than any one of our ambitions. You do not have to find it to be changed by the looking. Let the story settle now, the way stories settle in the dark hours, finding their level, becoming part of the quiet of the room. There is nothing more it needs to do. It has done what it came to do. The room around you is dark. The sounds of the world have drawn back to their most distant register, faint and occasional, the sound of the city breathing in its sleep. Your own breath moves in and out without any direction from you, as it has always moved, as it will move through all the long night ahead. The weight of your body is surrendered now to whatever surface holds it, and the surface is patient and asks nothing. The island of Atlantis has been gone a long time, if it was ever really there. The sea covered it, and the mud settled over the sea, and the centuries settled over the mud, and now all of it, the temple and the orichalcum and the warm springs and the golden bowl, and the 10 kings in their dark blue robes making their careful oaths in the firelight. All of it is only a story, written down in Greek in the 4th century before the Common Era, by a very old and very thoughtful man who had spent a lifetime watching what happens when people stop being careful with the things they have been given. He gave us this story instead. He gave us the island and the rings of water and the gleaming walls and the divine inheritance and the slow forgetting of it, and the sea that comes in at the end to take everything back. He gave it to us to keep, to carry forward, to feel the weight of in the dark hours when the boundary between what is remembered and what is imagined grows thin. Sleep now in the old way, trusting the dark, breathing with the night, carried gently on the long current of all the stories ever told in the human hours before morning. All the lost and gleaming worlds. All the warm lights going out one by one at the bottom of the sea, dissolving slowly into something calm and continuous and very, very old. The water closes over everything, eventually, gently without malice. And below the water there is silence, and below the silence there is the earth's own warmth, which has been there since before any of this, before the stories, before the searchers, before the first old priest in the first lamplit temple opened his mouth and began to tell a traveler about something the world had forgotten. That warmth is still there. It has always been there. Let it hold you.